So last week, we finished a series in the book of Judges called Unlikely Heroes. Really enjoyed that series. And in 3 more weeks, we're going to be starting our Hot Topics series, which is an audience-driven series where you email me topics and specific questions. Doesn't matter what kind they are. You can remain 100% anonymous. And what we're looking for is to find what are the things that matter to you and how does the Bible address them. What are some things you feel like churches or pastors don't talk about or avoid purposefully, or hot button issues that are current in our culture and so on. This is your opportunity, and I am doing nothing in preparation except responding to your questions, so they better be good. But we have these weeks leading up to this Hot Topic series, and I was working to put together a series from the Scriptures, which I normally do. I would grab a hold of a New Testament book that's short and preach through it, and I considered a few of those. But my wife's been challenging me for some time to ask God that week what he wants to speak to Christ Church with no planning, with no purposeful exposition tied into our mission statement, which is how I kind of always think and work. And so that has always scared me as a possibility. And yet, from time to time, in my own personal study, I'll have an experience with God's Word that speaks to me in a very powerful way. And if I share that with her, she's like, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Just preach that on Sunday. And so I don't. And so I was talking to her about these few Sundays we had, and she again just said, why don't you just bring something that the Lord has stirred in your heart? And so I decided to do that, and since I needed a graphic, I decided to call this little series of unrelated messages, New Message. Check your phone. God's got a new message for you. And so this morning, we are going to be looking at Luke chapter 8, starting in verse 40 and reading through verse 56. And the title of the sermon is Faith in the Waiting. Faith in the waiting. I would imagine every single one of you, no matter what your circumstances are, could conceive of something you are going through in terms of waiting. Waiting for a diagnosis, waiting for healing, waiting for an answer, waiting for forgiveness, waiting for a child, waiting for a spouse, waiting for the intervention of God into the circumstances that you find yourself powerless to control. So much of our Christian experience is lived in the waiting. And it's the place where the quality of our faith is tested. And so this morning I'd like to talk to you about faith in the waiting. And to do that, I'd like to introduce you to some characters that we meet in Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 56. I've preached from this chapter several times, pretty well actually. I listened to my sermons. I was like, not bad, Jarvis. That was pretty good. These chapters, whether it's Matthew chapter 9 or Luke chapter 8 or Mark chapter 5, where this story appears in each of those 3 of the synoptic gospels, accomplishes something about the power and nature of Jesus. He comes on the scene speaking words of authority and making everybody a little crazy, thinking he's blaspheming God, claiming equality with God, and then he makes good on those claims by doing the impossible. In Luke's gospel and in Mark's, we start with Jesus going onto the Sea of Galilee, and a huge storm comes up, and he's asleep in the boat, and the disciples come in and wake him up, and they say, "Don't you care what's going on up here?" Which is paradigmatic of our faith in the waiting, isn't it? We go to God with "Do you not care what's going on?" And in that moment, Jesus says, "Oh, you of little faith," right? And then he says, "Be still." And everybody freaks out. They go, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the seas obey him. This is followed by Jesus landing on the other side of the Sea of Galilee and interacting with a man possessed with thousands of demons, whom everyone around him had given up on, stayed away from, who was tormented, violent, and everyone's afraid of this guy. And Jesus approaches him and cleanses him of all these demons and puts him in his right mind, showing that he is not only Lord and has power over the dangers of nature, but over the demons of the spirit world as well. And then Jesus gets back in the boat, crosses the Sea of Galilee, and our story begins in verse 40. Now, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him, as we would be as well. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house. Now, what you might not be acutely aware of, because you didn't live in Capernaum in the first century, is that Jesus and Jairus were well acquainted. In fact, in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus is giving the distinct honor of reading the scroll, not preaching, reading, you read, somebody else will preach. He's handed the scroll as a young 30-something male who has some notoriety, and Jesus turns to Isaiah 61, and he reads about God's proclamation of favor and how God would move to bring good news and to bring sight to the blind and hearing to the deaf. And Jesus rolls up the scroll and says, now I'm going to preach you a message about Jesus because I'm here to fulfill this passage. And everybody did what they should have done if Jesus was wrong, and that is drove him to the edge of a cliff and tried to stone him to death. Jairus would have been one holding the first rock as ruler of the synagogue. The official position against Jesus from the Sanhedrin and the Jewish elite, among whom Jairus would have been a member and a part, was opposition to Jesus, and a plan has already been hatched to see that Jesus is destroyed. And so this is how Jairus is disposed to Jesus. And yet here we find him taking his notoriety, parting the crowds to reach Jesus, falling at his feet and imploring him to come to his house. What in the world would drive this man to this action? Verse 42, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. The next phrase says, as Jesus went, the people pressed around him. You see this terrible pressure that every single one of us can relate to, whether you have children or not. The sick feeling in your stomach as you imagine a child on the precipice of death cannot be helped, cannot be prevented, cannot be treated. And the news has come to a parent of an only daughter that it's time to say goodbye. She is on the slippery slope towards her demise. And Jairus, although he is opposed to Jesus theologically, he knows Jesus has power spiritually. And so he overcomes all the resistance he would have, all of the pressure to risk everything, his job, his position, his dignity, and he runs to Jesus and throws himself at Jesus' feet and implores him to come. And Jesus, who was his enemy, without question and without dialogue, goes with Jairus as Jesus went. Do you see what kind of Savior we have here? Brothers and sisters, doesn't matter how far you've gone against him, the moment you come to him, he comes with you. This is a powerful Jesus. We're told, though, that the people pressed around him, and we're also given a clue as to the nature of what Luke and Mark are trying to get done here with the phrase about 12 years, because we're about to be introduced to a second character who has also had something going on for the last 12 years or so. But you can feel at this point the time-sensitive nature of a child on the verge of death, a desperate father who's gone to Jesus, Jesus' willingness to go, and the movement back towards the house. We cannot get to her side fast enough. Time is of the essence. And in verse 43, something unusual happens that is easy for us to pass over if we're focused only on the power of Jesus. This is what it says. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. Now, this is really quite phenomenal what happens and what we're told happens. You may find it easy to relate to a parent with a child on the verge of death. We might quickly emotionally connect with that urgency, that sense of desperation and waiting and longing and needing God to do something. It might be hard for you to connect with the experience of a woman in first century Israel who had an issue of blood. This would have made her unclean by the standards of Leviticus in chapter 15. This means that she is not permitted to go to the temple, which means she is not permitted to be a part of the worship service. This means she is not able to touch another person without making them unclean, meaning she is now physically ostracized from her surroundings. Not only that, but if she is married, which we don't know that she is, she has to make a decision with her husband that they are going to live together in perpetual uncleanliness together or never touch. This means they don't share the same bed, they don't sit at the same table, they don't live in the same house, or both of them become distant from the community of God's people entirely. Imagine if she has children, which we are not told if she did. This means no kisses goodnight. This means no comforting scraped knees. This means missing your daughter's wedding. This is complete, abject disconnection from humanity. She hasn't potentially had physical contact with another human in over a decade. Meanwhile, as she sought healing for this discharge of blood, which is undiagnosed, she goes to doctor after doctor after doctor, spending all the money she has only to have no answer. In Mark's gospel, he says she suffered much from many doctors. Luke leaves that out. He's a doctor. Maybe she ended up worse than she started. Now disconnected, distant from God, impoverished, and having the same problem. She has the same concept, idea about Jesus that Jairus has. And so she moves to get a touch from Jesus. But what she knows is that he can't touch her without being ceremonially unclean himself. And so she concocts this idea that I don't need to touch him. I don't even need to have a word from him. I don't even need him to do something for me. I believe that if I can even just touch the edge of his garment, that will be enough to make me clean. And so in this posture of desperation, she weaves herself through this massive crowd. She worms her way through, knowing that she should not be making physical contact with anyone, assuredly bumping into many, only to come up behind Jesus. And the moment she touches his garment, instantly she is healed. You know that feeling when you've been sick so long you can't remember what it's like to be healthy? And then you get healthy and you go, oh, I forgot. This is the feeling she had in that moment. She knew everything was fine. Powerful encounter with Jesus. And if that's where the story ended, what we have is a picture of the kind of secret, miraculous power that's in Jesus' clothes. All right? Put it on, Jesus. Give it to me. I'll market it. We'll sell it. We'll ship it. Amazon Prime. Right? Everybody gets healed. Just touch the garment. But that's not what happens. In this moment of time-sensitive desperation with Jesus and Jairus making their way to Jairus' house to heal his daughter on the precipice of death, this woman interrupts Jesus' movement, and Jesus stops the whole process. You can imagine Jairus knowing the way to his house, leading Jesus on, the crowd following. He is maybe 5-10 steps ahead at a slightly more hurried pace, like a child trying to make it to the bathroom without losing the dignity of running in public, which a good Jewish man would never do. And yet, in his desperation to get back to his daughter, he's moving and moving and moving. And at some point, he realizes that Jesus isn't behind him anymore. That he has moved on from the crowd. He turns around to find Jesus having a conversation. This is ADD Jesus, right? Look with me in verse 45. Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all, including the woman, denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and are pressing in on you. Everybody's touching you. This is a silly question, Jesus." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." Busted. And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. We're not privy to the number of minutes that this conversation lasted, how long the silence hung out before it was broken by this woman coming forward. Seemed like Jesus wasn't in a hurry and was ready for an answer. And so this kind of awkward stillness ensues. This woman moving utterly slowly to take responsibility for what she has done. Meanwhile, a desperate father watches. Do you feel that tension? Jesus says to her in verse 48 with purposeful, I am sure, slow tenderness, paying attention to her so much so that she feels like she's the only person in the world. That's the Jesus I know. Locks eyes with her and says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Why do you think Jesus stopped to have this conversation? How do you think Jairus felt about Jesus stopping to have this interaction with this woman while his daughter is on her deathbed? Why did Jesus calm the whole crowd to have this interaction with this woman in this moment? Why is he drawing attention to her faith and not letting her get away with her drive-through miracle? These were the questions that, as I slowly studied this passage in my own personal time, settled into my own heart. I specifically began to connect with Jairus in a new way. As a dad of 4 kids and having had them at various times ill, you know that feeling of, as a father, of, are they going to be okay? I've never had a child so sick they were on the verge of death. I've never lost a child. I don't know what it's like to be Jairus, but I can connect with how he would have felt. And if I was him, I would be having a little bit of a problem with Jesus at this moment. What's the deal, Jesus? She's been waiting for 12 years. What's 12 more minutes? Right? She got her healing already. Let's go. And yet Jesus has no problem delaying his progress to Jairus' house. Why? So often, when we're suffering, when we're walking through difficult circumstances, when we're waiting on God, it appears to us that he doesn't care, or that he's focused on somebody else right now, and we start to have all those imaginations of, maybe I deserve this. Maybe I'm getting what I deserve. Maybe this will never end. Maybe those things that I thought I knew about God weren't indeed true in the first place. And what happens is, so many times, brothers and sisters, the waiting game starts to chip away at the faith we have. It begs us to ask the question about God's love for us, his character, his nature, his power or ability. And so there's this challenge to our faith in the waiting. And when I started to connect with what it would feel like to be Jairus in that moment, I started to feel that challenge against the waiting. It also stuck out to me the relative nature of waiting. Both of these 2 individuals have had something going on for the last 12 years. For this woman, probably hard for her to remember a time when she wasn't plagued by this issue of blood. It had been so long since she'd had physical contact with someone in a meaningful way that she wasn't ostracized or looked down upon. Certainly, people would assume she had done something wrong. Perhaps this is the judgment of God. Maybe it's a sign of her weakness of faith that she's not yet been healed. I don't know what the priest said to her. I don't know what the doctors said to her, but I know that she has been moving further and further and further away from meaningful, encouraging community with God and man. It's been a long road. When you start saying things like 10 years ago, that's when you start feeling old. That was the first time I started feeling old. Well, that was 10 years ago. Some of you guys are like, I can say 30 years ago. I can say 40 years ago. I can say 50 years ago. 12 years is a long time. And yet, if you're Jairus in this moment of tension, You're calculating your years based on maybe this is your daughter's last one. They will have seemed like they flew by. When you contemplate the possibility of losing your child so precious to you, those 12 years would feel like nothing, and this moment would feel like time had come to a standstill. And for both of these two people, their faith in who God is and what he's capable of and what he was willing to do for them, and those questions hang out there for us. But then the unthinkable happens. Verse 49. While he was still speaking, Jesus, someone from the ruler's house came and said, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." When I read those words, two emotions popped up in my mind as possibilities. Can you imagine for a moment with me? I don't know how long this delay was, but so often, when something doesn't go the way we planned, we don't get the answer to the prayer we've been praying, the worst case scenario happens, and we look to God and we go, "Why did you let this happen? Why?" And I encounter people all the time who've had this experience when the separation ends in divorce and not reconciliation, when the sickness ends in a chronic ailment and not healing, when the situation ends in a death or a demise or the loss of a job or a reputation, or when all the things you've been praying for fall flat against the floor of what you hoped could never happen, and you turn your attention to go, "God, why didn't you do something?" The second thing I thought was that it's very likely that Jairus looked at Jesus and thought, wouldn't have mattered anyway. It's too late. And what would he have done but immediately gone inward? Why did I wait to go to Jesus? He could have done something. I was too proud, too scared. I was afraid of what people would think. I couldn't do it, and I waited too long, and that's my fault. And the crushing pain that he's not only let his daughter down, but lost her forever, and that's on him. And I've seen that in people's eyes, the pain of a crisis of faith that isn't turned as if it's God's fault. It comes down on the self. Somebody walking around, maybe for the rest of their life, in depression and hopelessness and the crushing pain of that loss. I don't know which of those two or either that Jairus felt, because the text doesn't tell us. But what I can tell you is, I know who this Jesus is, and he's not worried. He says in verse 50, "But Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, 'Do not fear, only believe, and she will be well.'" Jesus is now capitalizing on the faith that Jairus had. Jairus had enough faith to say, if Jesus gets to my daughter before she's dead, there's a chance. And now that chance is gone. And Jesus says, guess what? I'm bigger and stronger and more powerful than you thought. And so don't fear. Let that ounce of faith that you had in me grow deeper, expand further, go past the limits that you placed on it, and she will live. I love that response. In verse 51 it says, "And when he came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter, James, and John." Everybody out, brings in the three, and the father and mother of the child, Jairus, Mrs. Jairus, the child. Here they are, standing around the bed of a breathless and pale child. All were weeping and mourning for her, but he said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, see the touch? He called, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned. And she got up at once. And he directed that something should be given her to eat. And her parents were amazed. Here they are. Jesus blew their minds. But he charged them to tell no one what had happened. This story is placed with the story of Jesus asleep in the storm, the healing of the Gadarene demoniac and the healing of this woman diseased, to show Jesus does indeed have the power. He claims to have power over danger, power over demons, power over disease, and power over death itself. That's the point of this passage. You could preach that and stop there. But when you zoom in to see this tension of these two people walking through the real stuff of life, the real suffering, the real waiting, and you start to evaluate the quality and quantity of their faith, some new lessons emerge, not only about the nature and power of Jesus, but about even the smallest, frail, little bit of trust and belief you can muster in Him, and how powerful that can come in your life to bring change. So often in the waiting, the quality of our faith becomes the thing we evaluate, the things that is tested, the things that is challenged, and it starts to get whittled down into almost nothing. And we have an enemy who would like to see that happen to the point when you say, God can't. And the words of Jesus are, do not fear, only believe. Now I want to point out to you just a few things, 3 short points to take with you. And I want you to prepare, like the daughter's parents, to be amazed at what Jesus is doing. Why the delay? Why not intervene immediately? Here's the insights. Number 1, sometimes your delayed answer to prayer is for the good of another. You see, we always ask the question, why? Why the waiting? Why the waiting? I've been praying, it's getting worse. Why the waiting? And the big answer is, I'm God and you're not. But the story points out the reality that God is doing more than the obvious. He is working for the good of everyone all the time in various ways. He is intimately acquainted with your situation, but I wonder if His delayed answer to your prayer is not for the good of someone else. You see, Jesus could have let the woman with the issue of blood touch His garment, be healed, and slip quietly away. And you know what she never would have heard? Daughter, your faith has healed you. Not the fringe of my garment. There was no magic in the fringe. It was faith and its object being Jesus. And you know what that did? It altered the relationship of her and Jesus. She began to know herself as a daughter of the Most High God, not a distant patient held at arm's length who happened to get healing because of a magic man's coat. No. And so Jesus says that's more important than whether Jairus' daughter dies or not. You know why? Because I can do death just fine. Real sick, dead, nah. You think Jairus knew that? Absolutely not. His perspective on God had a perimeter, and Jesus went outside of it. You see the testing of his faith right there? Jesus said, it's more important that this woman knows she's a restored daughter of God, that I raise your daughter from physical death or just heal her is not important. In fact, it actually works out better for me if she dies. What? And this is what the challenge of having a walk with faith in Jesus is like. Sometimes He just surprises you a lot and causes you to break free of all the limitations that you place on Him. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes your delayed answer to prayer is for the good of another. Secondly, sometimes your delayed answer to prayer is for the growth of your own faith. What Jairus and the woman both have in common is that both of them had some level of faith in Jesus. Both of them knew, if I get to Him, my problems can be solved, right? Maybe I got to get to Him before my daughter dies. Maybe I got to just touch Him and not make any physical contact. Maybe it's a touch in the fringe of the garment, which first century Jewish men had, representing the law. You can read about that as well. Something special in that little tassel. But it got them to Jesus, and this is what Jesus is wanting you to see. It's not so much how powerful your faith is, but what the object of your faith is. You know that? You may have a itty-bitty little tiny faith, but if it's in Jesus, it's going to get a lot done. You can have a great big faith in the wrong thing, and it'll let you down. But if you just have the smallest fraction of faith that moves you to Jesus, then prepare to be amazed. Because he doesn't need you to have strong faith. He just needs you to be attached to him who has great power. Can I get an amen? You can tie a really good knot around a really bad branch and hop on a tire swing and have a bad afternoon. You know that? Or you can be hanging on to a very strong branch with a very thin rope. It's about the object of your faith, not the quality of your faith. And Jesus will allow you to walk through these trials and meet you in the waiting and challenge you and the limitations you put on God. He's after the growth of your faith in the waiting. Jesus says to the woman with the issue of blood, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." He said to Jairus, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be well." He says, activate your faith on me, in me, toward me. Make this about you and me, and watch what happens. Lastly, sometimes your delayed answer to prayer is for your greater need to be met. There's a lot of Christian teaching in some theological circles that really focus in on suffering. They want to talk about it a lot. And sometimes, because of that, it can come across as though God is the author of your suffering so that he might sanctify you. Do you know that? And maybe it's not said explicitly, but underlying, it's suffering, suffering, suffering. And you hear things like, if you're suffering now, then you know what it's like. If you're not suffering, buckle up because it's coming. Now go and be blessed. Be warm and filled, right? And sometimes we get this concept in our minds that God is causing our suffering, and that is never the case. God does not cause suffering. He is the deliverer of suffering. He is the one who overcame sin and suffering, sickness, and the grave to deliver us out of suffering. And so he doesn't cause suffering, but he never wastes it. Ever. Sometimes you cause your own suffering because we do stupid stuff with bad consequences. Can I get an amen? Sometimes somebody else uses their freedom and it hurts you. It's not your fault at all, it's their fault. And God doesn't waste that pain. Sometimes just the fact that we live in a broken world filled with death and cancer and disease and unexplainable illness, car accidents and natural disasters, bad stuff happens. God's not punishing you, hurting you. He came to save you, to deliver you. And here's the good news. Even with all that terrible stuff, he will never ever waste it. He will grow your faith, but he's always doing more than you think. Sometimes the thing that's at the top of your prayer list is number 7 on his for you. And so he's always after your greater need. And so will you doubt God's love or power or character in the waiting? Will you live in guilt, shame, or worthlessness? Is the delay my fault? If the answer is yes, then you will. How could God let this woman suffer needlessly for 12 years? You ever wonder that? You know, Jesus was 18 years old working on a job site building houses somewhere while this woman's disease started. On the planet, the incarnate God was swinging a hammer while she was suffering. What are you doing? This is how we feel about our situation sometimes, isn't it? I know you can fix this now. Why won't you? Crickets from heaven. And yet we see in this passage that God is after the greater good. What's with his timing? The woman needed to know that she was a daughter. And we get this clue in the last piece. You know this phrase, child arise. You can't get this in the English. In Mark's gospel, it's in Aramaic, translated into Greek, and then translated into English. Jesus says, Talitha kumi, which is the most intimate little way you can say, sweetheart, it's time to wake up. You ever have to wake up a 3-year-old at 4 o'clock in the afternoon? It's terrifying, right? We have one rule in our house. It's don't wake a sleeping baby. It's just the worst thing a parent can possibly do ever. And waking up my 3-year-old yesterday with falling asleep watching TV. Hey, sweetheart, it's time to wake up. In these words, you see this beautiful intimacy that Jesus has towards this daughter. and you see the power of Jesus. He doesn't have to do any big hocus pocus. He walks into a dead girl's room and whispers in her ear, and suddenly she's revived. See, her greater need, the woman with the issue of blood, Jairus, the desperate father, all of them needed more than any physical healing, more than any deliverance, was to know who God really is. That is why Jesus came. That is why he lived. That is why he did what he did, stopped when he stopped, made people wait when he did, stuck his fingers in people's ears and spit on their tongue. All kinds of craziness. Why? Because he wants you to know him for whom he is, because in such of a relationship is where true life comes from. Jairus' daughter died again. Spoiler alert. But she lives forever because of those words. Hey, sweetheart, it's time to wake up. And here's the thing. This Jesus has demonstrated a character, a love, and a power that is worth every ounce of whatever feeble faith you have. And no matter what happens in your suffering, in your circumstances, one day you will die. And one day you will hear, my child, it's time to get up. And then we will be free to live in a world with no sin, no sickness, no suffering, and no death. And our job is to walk every day with faith in that Jesus through the waiting. Now, I don't know what you're walking through, not all of you. I don't know what it feels like to be you. But I want you to know that we all have the same Jesus. He looks upon you and says, you are mine, my son, my daughter. I'm here. I care. Only believe. And you will be well. And you will be as well as you can be. Maybe not everything the way you hope it'll work out. Maybe not what you can see. But you know that this Jesus who can raise a girl from death, heal a woman sick for 12 years, he can speak life into your situation. And if he is making you wait, it is for a reason, for your greater good, for the growth of your faith, and for the good of those maybe whom you will minister to because of how you know Jesus better. Amen?